All right, here we go. The impact of the First World War on two countries of the Americas: economic, political, social, and foreign policies. We are going over the United States of America and the impact of World War I on the U.S., as you've already gone over Canada, so that will be your two countries. Sometimes they'll ask if you just want to do one country, other times they'll say a non-U.S. country, and other times they'll ask for two. So that's why we're learning the United States. It can be one that you can use, or it could be one that you use as comparison to Canada. Now, in order to do this, I think, and do it well without overwhelming you, is we'll probably break this into two. This one, we're going to look at foreign policies and political, and then the second one, we will do economic and social impacts. All right. So in order to look at the impact, we need to look at U.S. foreign policy before the war. What you'll see here is this whole idea of isolationism, and this goes all the way back to the farewell address by George Washington. And isolation is kind of the go-to foreign policy of the United States of America. Evidence is Washington's farewell address, the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, siphoning off Western Hemisphere away from Europe. And isolationism really means isolated from European problems. The boundary dispute between Venezuela and Great Britain, basically shooting down this idea that Great Britain is the power of the hemisphere, but the United States is. The dealings with the Dominican Republic and Venezuela, where they took over the custom houses in order to control what was coming in and out of, or in order to control the debts that they had to European countries, and then the Roosevelt corollary that basically says we will deal with Latin America if you have debts or wrongdoings towards European countries that would then violate the Monroe Doctrine. So then we have World War I and the closing of the war. We're going to come back to this document right there. So let's go over the U.S. foreign policy during the war. The U.S. joins the war in 1917. Wilson negotiates the treaty in 1919. So we joined the war late, or the United States joins the war late. We've gone over kind of why they got involved. Wilson goes and negotiates the treaty, doesn't bring a Republican, which leads, and for a lot of other reasons, leads to the U.S. Failing to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. A mistake. The United States... Sorry, I need to deal with that real quick. So the United States fails to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. A mistake. The United States populace felt the U.S. participation in the war was a mistake and felt like the U.S. was drawn into an imperialistic war. The reason for isolationism against Europe is because of the way they've dealt with each other, the petty dealings, and it's led to lots and lots of conflicts over the years. And so the idea was that here again, we wound up in another Europe, or we wound up basically working with Europe, and we wound up in a war, and then they drug us into this, and it's Europe's fault. And so many people thought that this war was a mistake. They should not have gotten involved. They should not have had relations with Europe. And so that's one of the reasons you could say. And then the League of Nations fails, and the U.S. is not part of it, and that just even furthers this idea. We're owed $10 billion in war debt from European countries, and wanted to make sure that that was going to be paid. France and Britain hoped the U.S. would forgive that war debt, and the U.S. was not going to do that. U.S. involvement in the Russian Revolution. The U.S. had troops stationed in Russia from 1918-1920, supposedly to deal with U.S. investments there, but European countries did as well. And what was going on here is that in 1917 there was a general strike in the city of Petrograd, and what happened there was that general strike led to revolution, a communist revolution that swept throughout Russia, and the communists basically win the Civil War in 1920 and create the Soviet Union. This creates, in 1919, you could see the communists were going to win, and so the U.S. recalls their troops from Russia because they were fighting on the side of the whites versus the reds. And so they recall their troops. They don't want to be involved in Russia anymore either. So foreign policy after the war. U.S. participated when it suited U.S. interests. And this is basically what kind of Lodge and the reservationists really wanted, was that the United States would pursue a unilateral foreign policy, meaning that when it suited the United States, they would get involved. When it didn't, they wouldn't. But because they weren't part of the League of Nations, Harding felt like, after he gets elected, and we'll talk about him in a little bit, President Harding felt like he needed to do something to help try and prevent war. They negotiated their own treaties with each of the countries, and then retreated from international politics. The United States goes back into a stance of isolationism. The United States does, however, call the Washington Naval Conference, more formally known as the International Conference on Naval Limitation. Japan, France, Great Britain, the United States, and any other nation, those were the major nations that we're talking about strengths of Navy. The countries pledged to maintain a balance of their respectable capital fleets under a ratio and honor a naval construction holiday for a period of 10 years. The idea of the capital fleets meaning large ships of carriers and battleships. And so if you have a certain amount of large ships now and other ships, then you will continue at a ratio, building more and more. And this treaty was put in place to make sure it looked like that the United States was trying, and that we were trying to slow down the arms race. Even Senator William Borah, who doesn't want to get involved in any kind of international treaties, probably took the lead on this matter. He really felt and pushed Harding to try and limit armaments, especially because they were worried about Japan and the Far East, and they were worried about this idea that they might wind up eventually going to war with Japan, and so they wanted to slow down their naval construction. Japan was given the smallest ratio, basically, so after that 10 years, Japan would be able to build the least amount of ships. And Japan had this dream of having the strongest Navy, and so by signing this, or feeling forced to sign this treaty, and feeling like they were being disrespected by the others, this kind of upset Japan. But anyway, this is what the United States did. However, there is nothing to keep the United States from not building a Navy. There's nothing to keep Japan or Great Britain from doing it. But it is a treaty where the United States took the lead to try and limit navies. The United States scrapped or halted current construction on 26 ships. The British halted construction on 24, and the Japanese 16. So they were continuing to build their navies, and this treaty definitely halted that growth. Then, in the 30s, as World War II you began to see seeds of the Nazis taking over Germany and the fascists taking over Italy, and you begin to see, in 1935, Italy invades Ethiopia, and you start to see things move towards war. Instead of getting involved, the United States passes a series of neutrality acts that keeps them out of the war, based on why they got into World War I, based on not loaning money, based on not allowing Americans to travel on belligerent ships, not allowing the sale of arms to any of the groups. So basically, stopping all the things that allowed them to get into World War I. So, politics before the war. That is the foreign policy. You can see that the United States just wasn't very involved and returned to isolationism. Politics is Woodrow Wilson, the first Democrat to win the presidency since Grover Cleveland. He lowered tariffs, and a tariff is an export tax on goods that they bring into a country. You put tariffs in place to protect your businesses. The United States no longer needed tariffs because many of their businesses were well established and could compete with foreign trade, foreign companies. And so, he lowered the tariffs to allow more free trade, put protective policies to regulate business and protect workers. Further segregated Washington, D.C. during his time, because most of the time during World War I, or even before World War I, before the United States got involved, these were some of the things that Wilson was doing. He further segregated Washington, D.C., because he was from the South. D.C. was a pretty desegregated city, allowing African Americans to live where they wanted, work for who they wanted. And Wilson kind of pushed the United States further back on progress there. The First Amendment of the Constitution, which says free speech and the right to assemble is protected. The politics before the war is that you feel like Woodrow Wilson wanted to protect the First Amendment of the Constitution and also supported these ideas. But during the war, that becomes something that we need to talk about. So, number one, they managed the economy. We talked about this with the Imperial Munitions Board in Canada. There was the War Industries Board, which handed out contracts to different places in the United States and to different groups. And it furthered the industrialization of the United States. National War Labor Board worked really hard with labor to prevent strikes, to keep wages the same and try and prevent inflation. This allowed companies and wound up that companies made huge profits during the war and did not necessarily start raising wages or wanting to come down to a 40-day week or other things that workers wanted, despite the fact that workers, because of this board, really worked to keep that from happening. And then you had the Food Administration that set prices for farmers and set prices for different farm goods, rationed out farm goods. And so basically, the United States government really managed the U.S. economy more than ever before. And because of this managed economy, because of these things going on, it was difficult, or it was a negative thing when Wilson just took these controls away immediately. They did the War Revenue Act, which paid for demobilization. They stopped all the things that were going on here, and basically led to a recession because of the fact that farmers, all of a sudden the price controls are dropped and there's no more rationing, and there's just the rapid demobilization, dropping price controls, rationing, all other government control of the economy led to a recession, combined with the fact that there were layoffs and other things that happened because of the lack of demand. Another political issue is you had the Committee of Public Information, by a guy by the name of George Creel. It was a fight for the minds of men, for the conquest of their convictions, and a battle line ran through every home in every country. And George Creel was tasked with creating, he was in charge of the 4-Minute Men that would go up before movies and give patriotic speeches. They had movies themselves, and basically posters. It was a propaganda machine to make Germany the enemy and to rally the United States around the war effort, to get them to buy war bonds, to get them to enlist, to get them to get involved in the war and change the American mindset on the war so that the United States would get fully involved. Then you have the passing of the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918. The Espionage Act says we're going to try and catch people that spy, and if we catch you a spy, you break this law and we arrest you and sentence you. The Sedition Act of 1918 basically goes against dissent, does not allow people to express opinions which go against the government, specifically the Selective Service Act of 1917, which was the draft. And when they instituted the draft and started calling up and drafting young men to go to the war, there were people that spoke out against this draft, felt like this was not a popular war, that the draft was not constitutional, and went against the whole idea of the draft, which led some people to question whether the draft was a good idea or legal. And this is something that we will look at and do a little activity around whether they're right, whether the government should be able to take away the right of free speech during wartime. Election of 1920 was the idea of return to normalcy. What do you notice in the following quotes? And there is Warren G. Harding himself. You see, America's present need is not heroics but healing, not nostrums but normalcy, not revolution but restoration. Nostrums, a usual questionable remedy or scheme. So they don't need a quick panacea or a quick fix. They need to just come back to normalcy. We need restoration and healing. He's talking about a nation that was disillusioned by its participation. There's other things going on that a lot of strikes in the United States, riots, and so he's really kind of saying that, no, we need to go back to a more normal time. The question you could ask is, how similar is these where our supreme task is the resumption of our onward normal way? We must strive to normalcy to reach stability. How much does this say make America great again? How much is this similar to what Trump's message was throughout the campaign? It's something that we will discuss in our activities on this video. Labor unions before the war. The Russian Revolution in 1918 to 1920 started with the general strike in Petrograd. Strikes and socialist traditions and unions. Basically, the place where the United States, where people were communists, where people were involved in this, was in trade unions. Unions where workers would get together and do what's called collectively bargain together. And that's the idea that that unions were doing this. There was a lot of conflict between labor and industry before the war, leading up to the war, as labor wanted higher wages, better working conditions, 40-hour week, and industry didn't necessarily want these things because it takes away from their profits. A number of unions, radical ones that wanted drastic change, to conservative ones that just wanted higher wages. On the job for victory, you can see here that the United States Shipping Board, Emergency Fleet Corporation, this was a campaign put out by the War Industries Board to really say, hey, your patriotic duty is to work. Is not to go on strike, not to worry about your wages, but to work for the United States to make them stronger, to help them win the war and support the troops. During the war, patriotic duty wanted to share in the profits, that there were freezes on wage increases, but this was combined with this idea of 77% inflation. Workers needed wages to keep up. So during the war, they agreed not to have their wages rose, but there was a definite undercurrent that when the war's over, they expect to share in these profits because of the inflation, that their dollar is not going as far as it used to. And so although they feel like their patriotic duty is to create, is to do this, there was definitely a idea that the United States needs to then, or the industry needs to take care of the workers after the war. One of the things that you see right here is that in 1919 there was over 2,600 strikes where workers were trying to get together and get the right to strike, or use the right to strike, to get better working conditions, share more of the profits, and basically get more involved with what's going on. The AFL, the American Federation of Labor, police go on strike in Boston. This leads to a little bit of a some crime, and basically leads to some disorder within the city. The police chief fired 16 labor leaders, and Wilson denounced it as a crime against civilization. And so basically the police union takes a hit here, because if it goes on strike, obviously that leaves the city with a lack of ability to control its population. Now, there was also a general strike in 1919 in Seattle. Now, this is a big one because, as I was telling you before, that general strikes are associated with the Communist Revolution, that they did general strikes. And the general strike in Seattle in 1919 was one of the unions that helped organize it is called the International Workers of the World, the IWW. And they were led by a known communist, had socialist members, and really their whole goal was to overturn the capitalist system. Now, the general strike, this was a minority of the people. Many of the people that were involved in this strike were the shipboard workers that were not part of the IWW. There were, and then what happened was the ship workers walked out, and then all other unions, both conservative and liberal unions, called a general strike. And for 4 days, they completely shut the city down. Now, the mayor comes back and says, hey, we need to deal with this because this is a communist influence by the Russians, by the Bolsheviks, and the one strike that was to run by the IWW could have been influenced by communism. However, we know that the general strike in Seattle was really about wages. What happens in the end, though, is because they didn't set very clear goals, the strike fails, and Mayor Ole Hansen was considered a hero for defeating the possible revolution that was happening. But later the government investigated this and found that there was no general strike, fear of uprising within this. So we're going to talk quickly about the Red Scare, and then we're going to end this one. Actually, you know what? I'm going to do that in the next video. So that's the end of this video, and then we will talk about these in